6 anti-nuclear peace activists in federal court in Alice Springs, facing charges for entering the Pine Gap facility. It's got a long history, of course, of protesters trying to get in and cause mischief, but these recent protesters enter the base to sing a lament and to pray for the people killed by the drone strikes that Pine Gap plays a part in. If found guilty, the sentence could be up to 7 years in the slammer.
Es una absurda contradicción hablar de paz, negociar la paz y al mismo tiempo promover o permitir el comercio de armas. Esta guerra de allá, esta otra de allí, ¿es de verdad una guerra por problemas o es una guerra comercial para vender estas armas en el comercio ilegal y para que se enriquezcan los mercaderes de la muerte? Acabemos con esta situación.
I think outside of the church, we look pretty insane. You know, like, why would you do this? I think it's only in the light of faith that people can understand what we're doing. Why would you risk your reputation, your status? Why go to jail, you know?
Well, there's plenty in the church who think we're insane too.
But at least we've got the gospel. You know? At least we've got Jesus' action at the temple, you know, direct action against the money changers, and the history of the saints, standing against war even. That's the church we belong to, you know, the one with the history of martyrs and saints.
Pope Francis would be very supportive of our anti-war actions and our anti-armaments actions. He's spoken out very strongly against making of armaments and selling of armaments. Almost put the church into a pacifist position. We're called to bear witness as Christians, witness to the truth.
This is really the same as the Christian idea that we have to be with the poor or the people being blown up by bombs or the people actually affected by war, you know, the people who are affected by a particular problem. And I think when the Pope was talking about witnessing, I suddenly realised that he was talking about facing reality, this idea of facing the truth of what's going on, right? And so we had this idea at Pine Gap, well, I certainly did, was to go there and face it, like, because it's hidden in these mountains and it's sort of hard to see or get to. So I had this idea that we should go and see it and witness to it. I played the viola and we were looking at lamenting the global story of war that Pine Gap represented. Pine Gap is one of the military centres for the US. Its products have been death and destruction, and we were looking to lament that.
I started climbing this hill just over the fence. It was about halfway up the hill when we sort of realised we might not be able to get to the top to play the lament, so Margaret's idea was to unpack the instruments then and there and start playing as we walked to the top. we started playing a very dodgy version of this lament. At that point in time, it didn't have any lyrics to it. It was just a very simple, somber melody. Just before we got to the top was when they found us and started running up the hill after us, but Margaret and I reached the top and played the lament overlooking the base, and we actually stood there for quite a few minutes is what it seemed like. Everything kind of stood still.
We came in a place where they're obviously going to have cameras. It's a back entrance right near the road. There's the main back entrance to the whole base. So we knew we'd get caught eventually.
I was very emotional overlooking the base and just thinking, oh, this is it. Like we can only really imagine the amount of terror that this base right in front of us has caused, you know, the amount of lives that have been taken because of this, the existence of these buildings right in front of us.
Totally bizarre installation of technical domes and radomes and
something out of a science fiction movie.
Yeah, it's like a science fiction movie, but we're also aware of what it does. The amount of damage done from that place. Drones is just the newest part of the story. Right before the drones, there were the bombers, and before the bombers, there's the nuclear weapons, and before the, you know, like it's just a terrible, terrible history.
For 35 years, we've all been protected by a balance of terror. The strategists called it mutually assured destruction. What it meant was that neither side dared to strike first.
Now, if the United States is simply considering an attack on Soviet cities, then the loss of Pine Gap doesn't affect that. It can always attack Soviet cities. But it needs Pine Gap. Pine Gap is the only installation which can provide the sort of real-time intelligence on military targets in the Soviet Union.
Today, Pine Gap is quite different from the Pine Gap of the 70s, 80s and 90s. It was no longer a central intelligence agency, it's a military facility. The American military wanted this intelligence capacity to be turned to the use on the battlefield of Iraq and Afghanistan. And equally had a role in another area of war that had not existed in the 1980s, which was the use of data collected by Pine Gap enabled the White House to put together a targeting list and then to decide who lived and who died.
And just type in Pine Gap and it just comes up straight away. Here it is. You know when you've got an idea in your head and you kind of know that it's eating away at you, and unless you do it, you're always going to be kind of unsatisfied. I knew that it was something I needed to do, was to try and photograph Pine Gap if I could. These lights here would be the main entrance. So absolutely no chance that you'd get close to it from there. And these hills stop the view, so to actually see it or get close to it, you have to actually kind of trespass. I thought I'll come in this way and essentially just hike in through backcountry. In order to see the good view, you had to cross that fence. And you could see the whole base laying out in front of you, but I had the safety of being on a ridgeline, so if I wanted to duck back down, I could not be seen, and if I wanted to then look back up over the edge and see that view, I could. The place was literally kind of humming. There was a car that was going around a big surveillance vehicle. This big searchlight was just kind of panning through the whole landscape, and it panned over the hill that I was on a number of times, so I photographed the base when it was off on the other side. I thought, I've gotten this far, I've got the shots. I zoomed in, yep, they're sharp, ripper. And then I just grabbed my stuff and got the hell out of there and just pretty much ran the whole way back to the highway. But that's the crazy thing, like, they have this rule that says 7 years imprisonment for any photographic representation whatsoever, but then Google Maps, it's accessible to everyone for free, and you can zoom in reasonably high res on the place. So it's kind of, just seems a bit absurd. I put these bars over the top of it. Part of that was just not wanting it to be completely straight documentary. I wanted to take it a step further that was maybe a bit more conceptual. I thought the blue and red bars is the colours of, you know, the Australian flag, the American flag, the British flag, the colours of the empire, I guess. Could be like a barcode or it could be a prison, but it's just this kind of separation between a place where you're not supposed to be or not supposed to see and the outside world. I think we've got a real opportunity and responsibility to ask questions about that place and, you know, how it represents us.
It really began for me with Christian Lumley Ruff's photograph, which was presented as an artwork to make you think about what it is that goes on there and what is your relationship to it. I realised that despite living and practising journalism here for 3 decades, I'd done very little about the base. Like a lot of locals, I was, you know, obeyed the local etiquette of not talking about the war. You know, you meet Americans and you know you don't ask them about what they do in town, and there's generally a tremendous complacency in Alice Springs about the base. It's out of sight, out of mind most of the time. The protests come and go, nothing changes.
Close the bases now. And the police start the peace. Close the bases now. And the police start the peace. Close the bases now. And the police start the peace.
I have to take my hat off if I had one to every last young person would come up to Pine Gap and try to do something.
Close Pine Gap. Close Pine Gap.
I'm being arrested for illegal entry, trespassing on Commonwealth land. I'm claiming it's Aboriginal land for my Aboriginal heritage.
That was all 1987. That was the blockade of Pine Gap. We did the blockade, Beggars Blockade, and that's when I got arrested. I was dressed as a beggar, and there was a lot of people lined up on the side of the road with a banner saying, "It's $1.5 billion a minute. The arms race robs the poor." And this banner you've used a lot.
Yes.
It's a quote from
my
Genesis.
favourite banner. What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the earth. Genesis 4:10. We took that onto Pine Gap in 2005, hung it to the fence before Adele and I walked in.
A small group of Christian activists broke into Pine Gap in 2005. They had asked me to assist in their court case after they were arrested. We started to look very closely at what Pine Gap was doing, and in particular, these activists, Christians Against All Terrorism they were called, carried out a classic civil disobedience action in an almost perfect kind of way. And they maintained that the reason that they wanted to see Pine Gap closed was not about its nuclear weapons related activities, but its activities in relation to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan.
We were surprised when we learned that we were being charged under the Defence Special Undertakings Act of 1952, which is an ancient piece of legislation that's never been used before. This is a piece of legislation that carries a maximum of 7 years in prison.
It's a top secret facility. The government has kept under wraps all of its activities, and in fact so much so that not even Parliament is aware of what's going on at Pine Gap. The irony of the case is that to prove the offence was committed, the government had to prove in court against the Pine Gap 4 that the facility was being used for defence purposes, which meant they had to identify and disclose the intelligence gathering activities. The facility to be a defence facility must be used for the defence of Australia, not defence of the United States, not defence of the world against Iraq.
They refused to provide any evidence that was being used for the defence of Australia, and at that point the appeal was won.
4 activists broke into Pine Gap. It went to trial, they were convicted and fined, but they appealed and were acquitted.
Within a few months they had changed the law. They no longer had to show that it was for the defence of Australia.
We're obstructing the buses taking workers out to Pine Gap this morning.
This is my compliance. This is my allowing this to happen. This is me, part of the system. So that's why I'm here at the gates of Pine Gap, to resist this.
I've spent the past 18 months writing about events involving incursions onto the base by 6 peace activists, all of whom were trying to sort of say again what is our responsibility vis-a-vis what is happening in that base.
Why did they make the base here? Why was it built there? What for, you know?
We didn't know about all this space or whatever they call it.
And look, some old people didn't really understand
Because they are
what
all
it's
Aboriginal
for.
people, eh?
Yeah.
The elders, our elders, I mean. We never really got told about all this. And we still don't know now.
Yeah, we still don't know now. They never compensated anybody for putting this base here, you know?
It wasn't there when I was growing up. With my family, my grandfather, my uncles, my mum. That got put in there without our permission, without asking the elders.
It's like you stealing. It's all big secrets, you know? Must be because of, like, you know, people getting killed in other countries, you know?
Oh, well.
They have a war over there in that place, and we don't know. It might be coming from here.
Top secret.
Yeah, right, yeah. Because, you know, when passing in with Napajametler,
Yeah.
Barconet Napajametler, Kananganjakarkwan. They can't even talk to each
keep
other.
it to themselves.
Yeah, they got to keep it themselves.
Dad and I went and met with Coco, who was the owner of the land in which the Pine Gap sat on, the traditional owner, and so we got his permission to walk onto the base.
It was the land of our elders way back. Our grandfathers, their fathers, grandmothers, their mothers. That's how they kept their culture and the land.
We did have permission to walk onto that base. We had permission from the person who counted, you know. Nothing ever signed to hand over that land to the American Empire.
A secret base in Alice Springs, so far away her job still made her distraught. Yes, she thought upon who will we really stare.
The 5 just went over the cattle fence and were arrested almost immediately. Paul, who walked on his own, he basically spent several hours on the base before detection. They could see the base when they were arrested. They were praying, they were playing music, and the police were closing in all around them.
Give us a lament.
Well, wait.
all of us just, the whole trial, poured out our hearts to the jury and completely showed them exactly who we were. And so it was all very intimate, all of our statements, I think. So it was all in the spirit of that, which I'm sure was the things that made it hard for them to find us guilty of a charge that could land us in jail for 7 years.
The 6 peace activists have been prosecuted under the Defence Special Undertakings Act, 1952. The Act was written, during the Cold War to protect the British testing of the nuclear bomb tests on Montebello Islands. The people that they had in mind were saboteurs and spies. These people are far from that. They're warm, engaging, funny, principled, committed, generous people.
What have we done to deserve a horror such as this?
We chose to work together and run a trial on our own. The main benefit is that we get to be ourselves in the courtroom and tell the narrative of the story of what happened in a way that we have a lot more control over. We had to show that we believed that we were able to stop an extraordinary emergency occurring. We each had a number of documents or speeches that had influenced us personally to make us be of sincere belief that we thought that what was going on there was devastating, dangerous war. So one of the things that I had sharply been interested in was an interview with Michael Fraser. He'd written a book, and he was very clear that Pine Gap was part of the US war making, and that we were tied to the US through Pine Gap in a way that undermined Australia's independence.
Initially, Pine Gap was collecting information. It was, if you like, listening in. It's now targeting weapon systems.
Now to the most radical book ever written by a former Australian Prime Minister, called Dangerous Allies, by Malcolm Fraser.
I just want Australia to have the capacity to make its own decisions. In the old days, if Britain went to war, Australia was at war. I don't want to be in a position where if America goes to war, we also immediately at war.
But in any case, it was a screw the Aussies type project.
I tried to present the statement by Marchetti, who was a CIA agent during the time Pine Gap was set up. Was interviewed by Bob Plastow in a film, and in that interview he said that the Australian people were lied to.
When it was built, we were told it was a research station for upper atmosphere and space phenomena, a place of no military significance. See, I was told that it was a space research facility, joint facilities.
Well, that was the cover.
That's what all Australians were told.
Yeah, well, that was the cover for it at the time. At the time, it was considered a very sensitive operation. Not so much to keep the Soviets or the Chinese from knowing what we were doing, because obviously the Soviets are very good at this. They can see that thing up there. They know what it is. The main reason for the secrecy was to keep the Australian and the American public ignorant, particularly the Australian public.
The secrecy around Pine Gap was not to protect it from the Russians, but to protect it from the Australian people finding out the truth. So there was a 5-minute video which I tried to present, which was rejected by the judge. They wouldn't let me hold up the poster which we took into the base from the Gulf War of a grandfather holding up his granddaughter who'd been bombed. So I wanted to present that as evidence, and a couple of times I tried to do that, and even though it had been part of our arrest, they refused to let me show that to the jury. The judge had this reasoning that we could only present evidence that affected our recent mind in relation to the invasion of Pine Gap. But of course those things never left my mind.
When I got up to give my evidence, I was very nervous, and I talked about us walking onto the base. That was how I was going to start. And I got to the bit where we had standing on top of the hill playing our instruments overlooking the base, and then I broke down in tears and I couldn't speak anymore. And the judge actually had to call for, lunch at that point. He said, "Oh, look, you obviously can't speak now, so we'll come back after lunch." I came back then after lunch and gave the rest of my evidence very passionately. I remember coming down and Dad was crying. I also remember one of the staff members in the courtroom was in tears.
Reeve told the jury that they were not to pay any attention to what we had said in terms of why we did it, whether we were of sincere belief, whether it was an extraordinary emergency. He just cut all that out and asked them to make the decision based on the simplistic idea that we were there in a prohibited area.
5 protesters who broke into the top-secret Pine Gap Defence Facility in September last year let off with a fine. A 6th protester, 44-year-old Paul Christie, who trespassed on the prohibited site a week later, received a similar penalty. Justice John Reeves said the offending was unlawful but harmless.
Until you put your body on the line and risk something more than just a walk down the street, you're not going to change anything. As Christians, we believe in the power of faith, power of love, I suppose. We're not going to overrun the base and close it down, but we're going to do what little we can, and it's up to God to do the rest,
Sat there staring at the screen. Her last task of the day was plaguing her thoughts. A secret base in Alice Springs.
Next time on Compass.
When I think about phrases like special needs, they actually make me feel a bit uncomfortable. Whereas I'm just living. I don't think that I'm having any special needs. I'm just living my life.
I do what I want. I always have. I'm a writer who just happens to be in a wheelchair.
It was in high school that I started to begin to understand that difference could actually be the very thing that would help me find my people.
My wheels are my freedom.
Points of difference. Next time on Compass.